Hello, this is Aaron from Local Future, and I am here with David. David, how are you doing today?
Well, thanks, Aaron.
Will you just introduce yourself for any viewer who has not seen you before?
Okay. I'm a physicist, human systems ecologist. I've been working on all aspects of large-scale systemic risk and societal vulnerability, etc., for many, many years. And now, really, my focus is kind of shifting to large-scale preparedness, resilience, and how we deal within the realms of the possible rather than the um, totally aspirational with an increasingly dangerous, destabilized world.
And how do you say your name again? Slowly,
Uh,
for the
Kerr,
Americans.
Korowicz.
Korowicz.
Yeah,
Korowicz.
yeah. So, you know,
If you don't mind, I'm just going to call
I,
you,
I don't mind how it's
I
pronounced.
think I'm just going to call you David.
Yeah,
Korowicz. Okay.
yeah.
So, for those of you watching this for the first time, I've had David on several times. I had him on a couple of weeks ago and a couple of weeks before that. So right now it is 2020, May the 7th. Also, he came to the United States from Ireland back in 2010 and or 11, I don't remember, to give some talks about risk regarding civilization and the possibility of economic collapse and other sorts of risks to society, I guess you could say.
Mhm.
So today, what are we going to talk about? Well, we're going to talk about risk and assessing risk for yourself. How do you determine whether or not to pay attention to something in particular, and what should you be paying attention to, especially right now in May of 2020? And we all know what's going on in May of 2020. People are at home. People are concerned. There are things going on both in the medical community, the healthcare community, also in the economy, not just home, but abroad. There's issues with food security. There's issue with income security. And there are many people who are concerned and curious about what the future is. People are getting more and more, their focus is becoming more and more close to now. They're not looking out necessarily 20 years or 10 years or 5 years. Their focus is much more immediate right now. So that's where we're at the moment. And YouTube apparently is like hiding and doing stuff with videos where certain words are being in the translation. You know, YouTube goes through and it translates every video that's uploaded into English, and then it'll read everything's written, and if certain words are in there, it'll be like, oh, let's flag this video and have a human look at it and see if we should just delete it from the internet. And if they're not doing that now, then they could do that in the future. So in any event, I'm trying to avoid certain words that might be red flag words. But let's go back to,
But you can't tell me, or we'll be pulled off.
it's too late now. I can send David like a little comment. Where's my live chat? So yeah, I'll send David a few words. Okay.
Okay.
So
Our present difficulties.
yes, basically, well, not the economic difficulties, but
Mm-hmm.
the health and medical challenges
Mm-hmm.
that we're facing right now.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
okay. So here we go, David. We're going to make it really, really current. May 7th, 2020. We're going to talk about risk.
Mm-hmm.
So on the internet, in the past day or two, there has been a video shared. And this video shared is about the possibility that what governments are doing, saying, purporting, advocating for, might not be in the best health and welfare for everyone. There is a person. Her name is, let me look it up. Mary. And Mary is a virologist who's been around for a long time. I think it's Mary. Let me pull up a couple more pages. I should have thought of this a moment ago. Where did it go? Sorry for the delay for all the viewers. It's not Mary, it's Judy Ann Mikovits. And Judy is a researcher. She claims, a researcher into the origins of disease and things like HIV and AIDS and autism and chronic fatigue syndrome and all those sorts of things. Her claim is that the public is not being told the truth. But people are not listening to her because they've been told that she's not truthful. So what she's basically saying is that the entire approach to our health and medical issue that we're facing right now, the approach that's being taken by the medical community, by individuals, is almost the opposite approach. And she's not the only one who's on the internet and has been over the last day, week, month, basically, who's been saying similar things. So David, what do we do as far as how to think about this when we don't know what the truth is? How do we evaluate this risk that what's going on, what we're being told is not true? What is this historically? Are there cases in the past where people believe something that is not true because they're told an untruth, either wittingly or unwittingly? How do we evaluate this risk, and what do we do? Even if, let's say, Judy, there's only a 25% chance what she's saying is true, or a 10% chance, or a 1% chance. What do we do?
Well, I think the first thing is, especially at a time of uncertainty, there's more likely to be more, one can call them conspiracies, or one can call them alternative perspectives, often very wide-ranging, but sort of can give that people have a propensity to want, if they can't deal with the uncertainty, to want, say, all-pervasive narratives of, what's happening. So I think we need to be conscious of these things, that, there's lots of voices out there, and some of them are saying things that are clearly ludicrous, even if they have a doctor or a professor before their name. So
how do we know?
We've had people. So
how do we know that they're ludicrous? How do we know, though?
No. No. I was about to follow on a bit. So, for example, we know in Ireland and in the UK that people have been tearing down or trying to destroy they weren't even 5G mobile masks. They're not existing in Ireland as far as I know at the moment, but they were deemed to be the cause of the coronavirus. So in the broad sense, that sort of idea is kind of ridiculous.
How do we know for sure that there's no correlation or
Um,
causality? How do we know for
well,
sure?
okay,
How do we assess that
okay.
risk? What do we do?
Well, I use that as an example. Now, to my mind, they're saying it's coming from 5G, but it wasn't a 5G mast. So for a start, it's not even what they're purporting to say. And secondly, when we look how things spread, it's like it's spreading something that looks like a pandemic, not telecommunications masts, which would have a totally different sort of epidemiology if that was the case.
So you
But I
give the
think,
5G hypothesis little credence because it doesn't seem to match reality.
yeah, and well, that's one part of it. But the other side, I think, is it's the old part Occam's razor, or part listening to expertise. In other words, if for example, there is some knowledge about what's happening being kept. We imagine this government keeping a secret of some form and giving out other information. Well, the thing is, there's a whole world of different medical people, different specialists in virtually every country in the world who are, it would seem even more extraordinary if that they were all in a collective conspiracy, like climate change, for example, that, one could say, climate change is a conspiracy by the UN or something, and it's all nonsense. And one could go around and say, well, in order to justify that nonsense, you'd kind of have to tie in an awful lot of scientists and other people from around the world who are studying everything from glaciers to the migration of certain insects to do with temperature to changes in moisture. And somehow somebody has managed to corral hundreds of thousands of millions of these specialists to join in this conspiracy.
In many cases, as far as climate change, I think the people who question are not ones that question that there is changes going on. Their question is the cause of the changes and the causality.
Right. Yeah. And the causality. Well, I mean, there has been a mix over the years, and I think probably as it's become more apparent, some of the shape of where the criticism is coming from either the causality and then also around the cost. So they're saying, yes, it's changing, but we'll deal with it. It's not going to be a problem because we'll be so much richer in the future. No need to worry. So,
Now, I have many friends, David,
yeah.
and there are a fair few of them who do not subscribe to the hypothesis or theory that civilization is the cause of the current changing in the climate. Even if they accept that the climate is changing, they don't necessarily believe. So for any of them that are watching, how do we help them use their own logic to, because perhaps let's just imagine a world in which there is not necessarily a conspiracy, but suppose the only research that was ever funded, was research into how climate change was related to civilization. And that's the only research was funded. So if you were at university and you wanted to do such research, or if you were in government and you wanted to do such research, that's the only possible research. Now, for someone who wants to research, well, could it be something else? But there's no funding for that. So that means you have everybody doing research in a particular direction, and no one, unless someone's independently wealthy, doing the opposite research.
Yeah,
So
well,
how do we know that the system, not just in climate change, but in any situation, so like in 5G, in the current health issue, how do we know, and how do we assess the risks and probability that it's not some sort of a systemic issue, rather than how do we really know what's truth in that case? Because we know historically there have been stories told, like to the German people in the 1930s and 40s, which they believed strongly. They believed in this
mm,
story absolutely, and everyone went along with it. So how do we
well,
know that we're not stuck in a story like that?
well, I mean, I think part of humans is what we know. Well, the institution of science, um, because we all can't be experts in everything. So we always have to kind of say, well, um, one part of a judgment is about expertise and track record of an institutional structure like science as a whole, rather than specific scientists. Another is about where one has skills or some knowledge of making reasonable judgments. Um, but one of the things we know, well, here again, it's part of human behavior, or what we understand by human behavior, is we're an ultra-social species. And part of how we form groups is shared ideas, shared knowledge. And the more polarized a society or groups are, the more ideas become defining ciphers for a group vis-a-vis us and versus them. And people will hold views that are really very strongly very divergent from realities, and I'll give an example of them in a moment, with great tenacity, because really it's about group identity shaping the beliefs, rather than the beliefs being things that are discussed and become analyzed through other means. So famous examples would be people who sort of have been told, the end of the world is nigh on the 13th of July. We'll all wait and we'll all be taken up to heaven, etc. These sort of millennial groups. And then the 13th of July comes and they all gather on the hillside or wherever they're meant to gather. And, the day turns into evening, turns into the next day. One would say, well, do we need to do a revision of whether the source of this knowledge might have an issue? But you'll find no, most people hold on to it even tighter, and generally you'll find the prophet figure can say, no, I've made a mistake in my calculations. And this can go on in multiple rounds. But what's important is, it's part, the belief becomes part of the identity and a way of defining outside groups, out groups. So this is a feature of human behavior as well. So it allows us, and you can see why it's an important social species thing. We can't take in or understand everything. We have to take a huge amount on a type of trust. Because the world is much more complex and cognitively complex. That's how we can live in a complex society, is that, the system itself and the collective minds and structures hold information that we don't have to process or work out. And one way of doing that is sharing beliefs that work, or at least work in terms of group formation. And it might be also in terms of gathering resources, but these things are all interrelated. So, I mean, that's part of group beliefs as well. People can hold on to beliefs that you kind of say, this is clearly erroneous, but it won't make much difference. And you'll argue with somebody, and really the argument doesn't change their opinion, because they're already, I'm this group, you're an out group. I will keep arguing with this and I will keep believing it because it's part of how I construct my identity. with relative to you as an outsider critiquer. So this is part of things as well. It's not that everything comes with evidence we can analyze. There's too much out there. But one of the things about science broadly is, firstly, it's an institutional process or structure. And we can see it's been pretty effective in terms of, we live in a world of technology that also has a deep relationship to science. That we can launch a satellite up and send a satellite spinning around planets far, far away, is a pretty good justification of our understanding of the laws of motion and dynamics. That we're not throwing these things up into space randomly. We plan them to go places and they kind of go there. And we can spin them around for changing direction and momentum on other planets and trajectories, etc. So, we can, out of this comes predictions and our ability to do things. So it's a pretty good system in its broad sense of being able to tell us something true about the world. The other side of it is it has an error correction of a sort. So you gave the example of, let's say, climate change, people were saying it's only funding for one part and you don't get funding for looking at other parts. Well, one of the things about science is things are rarely that rigid. There's always scope. And as much as funding for, one of the things scientists, like everybody else, are interested in is status. And one of the ways you get status is by getting great evidence to prove that your colleagues have been misinterpreting something. That's why we remember Einstein or Bohr or all of these people, because they challenged and they were successful. So that's part of the error correcting process within science, or not so much error correcting or improving nature of science. And it's also not just funding and money, because people have issues around, humans have issues around status, and you get rewarded by your colleagues, even if you're an outsider, if you can come up with a brilliant theory. However, we all know that there are examples here and there of people who've had the correct idea, but they were ignored or ridiculed, and then sometimes decades hence, people kind of go, "Oh, that was that woman had that idea way back," and that happens too. So people can become rigid, or also sometimes it's just a matter of people might have the right idea, but all of the evidence isn't strong enough, etc. So this was, Thomas Kuhn wrote about the structure of scientific revolutions. He was kind of saying, well, mostly science has got, in paths of science, is pretty incremental. You add a little bit to the body of knowledge, and every now and then, people start to see, there's a growing gap between what we understand of the world and some of the things that evidence is teaching us. That something might be wrong, but sometimes you can also find that people just say, okay, how do we interpret this new information, but we're stuck within the old frame. You know what I mean? So we're trying to fit this new knowledge.
This reminds me of,
quite make the break.
This reminds me of Einstein and his, I don't know if reluctance is the right word, but how when quantum mechanics was being developed, how he did not like the idea of uncertainty on the subatomic level, that it's about probability waves and it's not about perfectly predictable behavior.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not sure if that's a great example, because there you had a still like mysterious world of quantum mechanics, classical world, and they're still debating this because it is a strange world, and how conceptually do we fit it into our mental models of what's happening? Because things seem, it's very spooky action at a distance and these sort of ideas. I think probably a clearer example would be the heliocentric view of the solar system. Because what was happening in before Galileo was that there is the Earth and the planets and things going around the Earth, and of course people were saying this causes all sorts of problems in our understanding and view of from observations. Things don't seem to match here and there, so they couldn't quite lift themselves out of the Earth-centric system. So they started to say, okay, well, if we make cycles upon cycles, so rather than just things going around in circles, there are smaller circles of planets going around and outer circles which have further circles. In other words, to keep the belief of the Earth-centric system, they had to, as new knowledge and information came in, they started to make it more and more complicated and obtruse to say, they didn't see it like this, but to save the Earth-centric perspective of the world. And they just thought, this is right, so we must need to add something more or do something different. And of course, once
This
you
reminds
flip it
me
and say,
of current economic theory.
yeah, that's a good example now. You'd find lots of examples. And of course, then it takes somebody to go, well, rather than make this thing more and more complicated, this old idea, to save the conception, you just make a simple idea and say, it's no longer Earth-centric, it's heliocentric. And that things go around it in ellipses, planets go around in ellipses. Then suddenly all of these epicycles, as they call these circles upon circles, weren't needed anymore. It was much simpler. And now you could start to look at like Kepler's laws and all of that. You could start to see some mathematical relationships, and you could say, not only is it easier, it allows us a much deeper understanding of what's happening and to calculate things, etc. So, but the paradigm shift in Thomas Kuhn's world is there was a stickiness to just accepting the new view because people are invested in the old one. But, we don't remember all the people who were fiddling more epicycles on the old idea. The famous person is Galileo, and there were others, but the famous person is Galileo, and that's part of the status. So there is this error correcting, and yes, things can be sticky, or older days can be sticky, but it's a pretty good institutional structure. And then the other thing is, I think, when we sort of say, trying to look at ideas of truth is there's been lots of, if you say, look at the pandemic, the current events, you say, well, the first thing is that this is something that's been well predicted. We have a lot of knowledge from previous events, SARS and all of that, this might be happening. People have been concerned enough in many different countries that they've run exercises to prepare. And most hospitals in a lot of countries would have somewhere, even if it hasn't been exercised, they'll have a book on what to do in this sort of crisis.
Well, I want to jump in there before you continue with your thought. And so I think there's a question of, we know that these sorts of things have happened throughout history. Mm-hmm. We have historical stories and a few people have memories of previous events, like in the 80s and the 20s and whatever. So the questions are really, at this point, what is the origin of this now? You know, where did it come from? What is the process by which it escaped and got to us or was released or whatever? And the second is, obviously there are responses which are very, very different in different countries, in different places. And how do we know what path we should be going on? I mean, we have New Zealand doing one thing, we have China doing something else, we have Sweden doing something else, we have Ireland doing something else, we have Michigan doing something else. And so and then here's something that really gets me. In the US, for example, all the hospitals are running out of money, every single one of them. And the reason they're running out of money is because they're private institutions which rely upon elective surgeries, and a lot of elective surgeries. Their revenue stream has been cut in to about a third of what it typically is. And so they're experiencing extreme stress. At the same time, for patients that are coming in right now, they're being paid a certain amount if it's that diagnosis by the federal government. And if they need to have ventilation, they're being paid about triple that amount because they need ventilation. So there's an incentive for all the hospitals in the United States, at least, to prescribe a certain treatment. So one of the questions is, how do we know what is actually true? I mean, what treatments, if you have someone that says this treatment is actually the correct treatment, but this is the treatment that is being funded, how do you know which one is true?
Well, okay, I think the first thing is, this is novel, so people are learning on the go. So there will be an inherent uncertainty as to various aspects of the treatment. So even at the very beginning, and even now, is like, what are the symptoms? Yeah, and they're discovering new symptoms and paths as things go along. And these are complex illnesses, so there's lots of different drugs, for example, that can be used for different parts of the symptom, the aspects of the symptoms. So one first you think, it's not like the book has been written on this is what you do, ABC, these are the indicators, etc. It is a real life learning process for the people involved. Obviously they draw upon their skills, etc. So there can be an inherent question and uncertainty in all of that. It's very understandable and to be expected. As regards the US, well, there's people outside the US kind of know the US makes up about 5% of the global population. So, the whole world isn't jumping to the economic incentives that are existing in hospitals in the United States. So, there's not somebody enforcing a whole worldwide view based on that. I think those sort of economic incentives are, it's bad in healthcare in general. One hopes doctors having their Hippocratic oath and all of that don't fall for it. But in any group where those sort of incentives and organizations where those incentives exist, it will be more likely that sort of people will tilt towards where the money is, or there will be institutional pressure to do these things. That said, that doesn't change the broader global question of people trying to help. I mean, so it's not just about, some secret government stuff in one place. It would assume that there's something going on everywhere and everybody is compromised across the world, which would be highly unlikely, just in probabilistic terms, that, you know, there are a few plucky whistleblowers and everybody else, all the other medical people in the world are doing their damnedest to damage and hurt people, but they've somehow all decided to keep quiet and keep mum. So, yeah, that as probabilistically just seems like a really bad bet to assume. Yeah, so there can be, yeah, as I say, there can be, so, generally you'll find, that, there may not be secret anything at all. Well, there may not be anything secret at all. If there is bad things happening in certain places, kind of look at the incentives. You don't need anything too conspiratorial to just say, well, mistreatment might be more likely to be possible.
Well, and that's kind of what I'm getting at, because I think that it may not be that anyone is meaning harm at all.
Mm-hmm.
Just like I don't imagine there's really anybody that has meant harm to planet Earth. And yet here we are, and our climate is in the state it is, and the land and the biosphere is in the state it is. And I don't think that anyone made any plan or is intentionally trying to get it in this direction. I think everybody is trying to do what they believe is best and right.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, everyone has to take care of their own selves, which means taking care of their own income and their own family, which is they depend upon the system for that. I mean, most people do not know they don't have the means to go out and just gather the food they want from the outdoors and come inside and, there we go. So can we turn the conversation to something related but similar? What should we do? Imagine we're in a theater and we suddenly find out, we see someone indicating that there's a bomb. Now that person we recognize, or we mention it to our neighbor, and the neighbor says, oh, that person is a liar. So as far as risk analysis, we see a couple people leave the theater. What do we do?
Well, I mean, one would need more context, but it's interesting, like the theater is often used as an example of people are, again, we mentioned groups, and people are quite group conforming. So there's been all sorts of experiments of, in control situations where people are in a room where some of them are, unbeknownst to the others, working in the part of the experiment, and smoke is let into the room like there's a fire starting. And if people are there on their own, or there's a couple of them, you generally find they look around and kind of go, well, I think I'll just head to the door. Might be a good idea. But you'll find that in some of these experiments where the people who are secretly part of the experiment will just look up and stay seated. And then other people who are being experimented upon will kind of look around and say, what are they doing? And it's like, well, I don't want to stand out. I don't want to be seen as overreacting or not being cool enough, or just saying, well, if they're doing it, I'm going to stay here. And it's one of those examples again of group conformity in situations. So the theatre example firstly reminds me of that there's always this in those sort of situations. Now, I mean, if somebody was in a theatre and said, I have a bomb, in Dublin, you probably kind of go, well, it's not like we're bombed very often. And if they say of it, what,
So what do you do,
well,
David? Do you just sit there? You.
would kind of look at the person and sort of say, well, but it would be pretty unlikely. I mean, there aren't bombs in Dublin. There are more mad people shouting out about things in Dublin than
So
there
if,
are bombs in Dublin
so if
by a
someone,
lot.
so if someone in the front row
Yeah,
hollered,
yeah.
there's a bomb there, and runs out of the theater, what do you do?
Well, again, it's context specific, but um, yeah, probably kind of go again that sort of, if I was in certain other countries at certain other times, I might kind of go, okay, I'm getting out now. But if it was in my home city, and you kind of go, well, how would a person recognize a bomb? It's a dark theater. Do they plant it? Do they, all of these sort of questions. But again, like, you'll have to try me you'll have to run the experiment and give me the actual
What
context.
is the
But I think,
logical thing to do?
well, again, there's always going to be judgment in this, and as I
I mean,
say,
this is very rare. Like
it's
I've
very
never
rare. Yeah,
experienced this in my life ever.
that's why
What's the logical thing to do?
I would probably just stay seated, because it seems like, as I said, there's a lot more mad folk around shouting things than there are bombs going off in my city. There are, I have no doubt, thousands of people around my city, especially as everybody's been cooped up for the last 2 months, shouting mad things.
But doesn't Ireland have a history of
Yeah,
stuff
and
like this
especially,
over the last few hundred years?
oh yeah, no, well, during the Troubles, which was mainly in Northern Ireland, not the Republic, there was a bomb in 1974, but it was out in a street. It wasn't in cinema. But that conflict is, at least for the moment, not happening anymore. You can never say never, but and it would also be like, would your first bomb be in a random cinema, or would you rather, you think they'd go for something a bit more symbolic than, in the cinema? So most likely, so as I say,
So if it wasn't
there,
so if it wasn't
there,
cinema, but if you were in like, what is your parliament called? Like if you were deliberating.
oh yeah, well, yeah, our doll, yeah.
So if this was one of your representatives who yelled this in your dull, then what would you do?
Representatives.
Whatever
I
they're
mean,
called.
yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, if it was a time of conflict or growing tension, it would be, one's risk calculus would change because the environment outside has changed. If if it was if it was something where you thought, well, the person probably knows what a bomb looks like, and there are a couple of people now in our parliament who probably do, given their past history, you might take another view that this is worth listening to. But again,
And
a lot.
what if the people around you have told you that this parliamentarian, he's a liar?
Well, I don't
He
know a
lied in the
lot.
past, he was arrested once.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, if this guy was always going, like, look, if this was like one of the guys, like you find every now and then in the street, kind of, sort of saying, the end of the world is nigh, these people are, sort of off on one, you're not going to, their credence will go down, of course.
No, just like somebody who keeps on warning, trying to say, the economy is not going to do well and we need to be preparing for the future.
Well, that's
And
different from somebody saying there's a bomb.
but
Uh,
this is why they don't believe them,
well,
because they're making extraordinary claims and they're not to be believed.
I think, well, I think, I think, I think, I don't think the analogy is a bomb, quite
Okay.
frankly. Um, I think there it is more closer to that sort of paradigmic view that we talked about in terms of Galileo and that shift. That because, one doesn't need to, one might disagree with it, but we know that there's lots of concern about the environment. We know that we are in the moment of a pandemic, which has relationships to our impact on the environment. Um, somebody might have known that these arguments have been going on since before The Limits to Growth was written in 1972. So the whole cultural context of these sort of discussions. Now, one might be of the view that, this is old hat. Malthus said this 200, more than 200 years ago. Whereas Malthus now, he's like, the guy of failed predictions. And Paul Ehrlich talking about a famine, 1960s. The population is 2.5 times more, if not, than since when the population bomb was written. And you might go, well, and economists say, well, look, or we have human ingenuity. There's no limits to human ingenuity. So, whenever we have a problem, we're going to human ingenuity away from it. And anyway, look at past history. We've been growing. Yes, we've had our troubles, a war here, a crisis there, but everything goes back on track. So, and also, you can find a whole narrative to justify your opinion. It might be the majority view that we'll keep going, but it's not like a bomb, because you have a whole history and conceptual and long-term discursive discussion about it. But like the example of the epicycles being used to complicate an old paradigm that evidence seems to be suggesting should be changing. So you're kind of going, yes, we know we have problems, but we'll innovate more, better. Look, we'll hydrogen cars and all of this sort of thing. And yes, I take your view that we might be doing damage to the planet, and probably some species are going extinct. But when we're richer and we can fix these problems and make it even better, so all of these possibilities are there. So you're more likely to find that type of denialism now. And adding complications, well, climate change, yes, it's bad, but we're going to be growing by 3% per annum. And the cost of climate change, if you look at some of the economic models, they're published by, I won't call them scientists, but economists, who say that the cost will be just a few percent of GDP, even if it's 3 degrees centigrade in a few years, or towards the end of the century. And we don't need to worry our little heads about it, because we're going to be so much richer then, because richer is what happens. This is the universal law of nature. So one's more likely to find that as an argument, and there when one's talking about, well, how do you delineate? How do you say what's true? Well, on one side, we know that there is a human propensity to, cling to old views, and there's a good evolutionary reason for that. Like societies couldn't hold together if it was every time somebody had a new idea, we were going like, wow, follow this way, wow, follow that way. It couldn't stabilize and organize itself. It would be destructive. So, there's a good evolutionary reason why we stick to beliefs for a while, even if they're erroneous. But you could say, well, here's the thing, and this is what I do with people when I'm talking about, how do you make decisions? Well, one thing that I do less of now is say, this is what's going to happen. What I say is, we don't know what the future is. Future is a kind of a probability distribution. So and when we ask what risk is, we say, well, risk is a likelihood. How probable is something going to be? And it's an impact. How hard or indeed good is the result of that thing that there's a probability? So our risk then is the mixture of the two. So for example, a huge big asteroid hitting the Earth could be incredibly impactful. It could be existential for us. So, but the likelihood, at least in our lifetime, from what we know, is extremely small. So at least if we're talking about our lifetime and a few generations ahead, you kind of go, it's low risk, even though the impact would be huge, because just the chance isn't high. You can go to another side and say, well, what's the chance of me having to take a day off because I'm ill in the next 2 years because I have a cold? Well, actually the probability is pretty high, it's something. But the impact is pretty low. It's not earth-shattering. It's a day in bed. So the risk is pretty low also. So when we think of risk like that, we're trying to say, well, where does the risk lie and where does the probability distribution lie? So now I have a diagram I use for the transformation of risk to show it. So I won't bring it up now, but it's more or less saying, here's a distribution of risk. And one of the things it has is, well, we're in a more and more complex, interdependent world, more and more high speed. And as people are learning now from supply chain breakages and from the current crisis, etc., that global interdependence can be a source of vulnerability. Shocks can spread through it. If it's missing things, it can disrupt other things and they can cascade. So there's that. We live in a system that's vulnerable. And it's also, of course, part of our adaptation system. So, so that's our structure of our civilization. And it's been hit by multiple stresses. The impacts of climate change are one, but there's other environmental things like biodiversity loss, constraints in oil production, aquifer depletion, our over-leveraged credit system, growing social unrest and difficulties between. So you can say all of these things and say, well, these things interact cumulatively through this vulnerable system. So what happens? Well, most of the tensions the stressors are growing. So the impacts of climate change are more likely to be greater in 3 years' time than they are today. And they're more likely to be greater in 10 years' time than in 3 years' time. So these stresses are growing. Likewise, say the aquifer depletion. So you're more likely to get more food crises because of climate, because of depleting soils, etc. So I don't know what year will happen. We're more likely to get it in future. Likewise, water crises. Are we more likely to have a credit crisis? Well, we're adding more and more debt. So unless we find a way around it, yes, we are more likely to have one next year than etc. So we say stresses are increasing. They interact and they disturb the system and can generate new stresses. So you kind of say, well, one side of what's happening is you could probably say that there is a distribution of probabilities of next year's economic growth. And 3 years and 5 years And that distribution changes, but one side you say is there's more likely to be lower growth because more things are hitting the system. But the range of that lower growth is also likely to be wider. Why? Because there's so many interactions, it's harder to predict. So, your distribution of the possibilities get wide. There still is, because a distribution also is still running, there's still a probability that we'll have 3% or 5% economic growth. It's just that that probability is getting lower, while the probability of a wider range of lower GDP or bigger economic crises is growing. So all of that exists together as to what happens in 3 years or 5 years. There's also a probability that's growing that there'll be a large-scale structural failure, which is collapse. And as your system weakens, if that's what's happening, the risk of collapse is also rising. So the thing is, all of these things can exist together. You can have a probability distribution where next year's growth is 3% or even 5%, that's there as well. There's a probability, there's a bigger probability that it will be a range of things, a growing range of things that are going to be lower. And there's also a growing probability of some sort of big structural failure like collapse. So one of the issues about all of this is, economists have all of these models that are developed over a period of long-term stability. They're for various reasons, and there's probably another conversation, a more techie one, but they're likely to be more and more inaccurate, for looking at this sort of evolving world. And our ability to predict particular things is going to be harder, but we can say in the general, in general, things are going to be getting worse, and there's also a growing risk of systemic failure. But there's also a chance that we'll have good economic growth. So if you're talking to somebody, say, well, that's your risk profile. There's a probability and there's an impact, likelihood and impact. And what I would say to people is, look, it's kind of like this. You might have a different view from me in terms of what the likelihood is of something, of what economic growth might be shifting more like in 3 years or 5 years, or a different view of collapse. So you draw out your probability distribution and I'll sort of the shape of mine. Now, the thing is, they might have a higher probability distribution, or saying, oh, well, we're much more likely to have 3% growth next year. Yes, we might have a war or something that knocks us down, and here we have, and yeah, I could see maybe there is a bit of a probability of collapse, but this is nuclear war or something like that, or whatever. But we'll realize that actually parts of our distribution cross over. We might have different things. But at least we have a place to start talking that's common. So that's one thing is, that idea of you don't want to, the thing is when we do well, you say this, so I'm going to force you, I'm going to make you agree with me that your view on what's going to happening is wrong. You kind of say, well, where do we find in this? We have different risk maps or risk profiles. So where do we meet? And I can admit in this that we're going to have growth because that's part of my risk distribution. It's just smaller than yours. So that's one side of getting over the people trying to hold on to their identity in terms of, I don't believe in climate change or something like that, or I don't believe, sorry, excuse me.
No problem.
Oh, excuse me. So we can disagree, and then the other side is, well, here's the thing, we found this some common ground, and we can discuss different shapes of the distribution between us, but it's now not a binary thing. You believe it, I don't. And you can even say things like climate change. Well, it mightn't be as bad, but thing is, we know there's uncertainties in things. We know there's, and uncertainties can work both ways. But here's the thing, that the impact is important. But if things go wrong, they could go really wrong. So it's like buying insurance on a house. So I might think, good grief, this area has become very fire prone. I'm definitely worried about making sure I'll have fire insurance. The other person might kind of go, oh, it's always been like this, changes, but not so important. But the question is, well, we might have different views on how likely our house is to burn down. But for both of us, if our house burns down, it's pretty catastrophic if we have no insurance. So, there's a part saying, well, you know what, you mightn't agree with me about what the need for the insurance is, but you know what, in one level, you can do your thing, but you should be kind of glad that at least there's a few people over here, just in case, working on the downside. Because neither of our distributions are perfect. We haven't put figures on them, we've put shapes. So both of us live with uncertainty. I'm just somewhere else on the distribution in terms of risk. But if I'm doing something that's looking at downside risks, we don't have to fight about it. We can kind of say, well, you go with your thing. I'm glad somebody's going to be putting some money on the insurance on the downside. And I think when we talk about risk like this, I mean, what you're trying to do is, one is find ways out. One is actually just be correct, because we live within distributions of outcomes. And we do have to make decisions, and good decisions are made about thinking about those sort of distributions and how they change. But the other is, it kind of stops, or at least cuts a little bit into the binary thinking, where it becomes tribal. So it has to be all one way or all the other way. You can kind of go, well, my distribution allows continued economic growth. It just says it's less likely than yours, and it also, when you think in terms of likelihood and impact, it's like insurance. The downside risk of not having insurance is so big that, aren't you glad we're doing something on it, or somebody's working on it, even if you're not?
Well, I think that is a great spot to kind of wrap this up, since we've been chatting for about an hour, and I think we can have a quick chat afterwards, just to think of future chats we might have. So I think, in summary, what I'm hearing is that there are two ways of looking at risk and the future. One way is kind of a binary way, where it's either you say, well, that's not a risk, and so I'm going to ignore it, and I'm only going to think about this particular future. I'm not going to worry about those other particular futures. I don't think they're going to happen. I should only think about the future that I expect to happen, and that people are saying that's going to happen, and that's the future I should think about. I shouldn't think about any other possible futures, versus rather seeing it more of a array of possibilities, some which are more likely than others. And rather than being certain about something, since we can't really be certain, that maybe we should be willing to consider that there are a lot of different possibilities, some that we don't necessarily like, some that aren't necessarily the consensus view. And it's not bad at all that we think that way. And it's not bad that other people look at the future differently, especially if they're willing to, rather than being binary, if they're willing to look at it as really probabilities. The probability that I'm going to get to Ireland in the next 10 years, there's a probability of that. But I don't know what that's a very specific, but I think that's kind of what the point that you're getting at. That
Yeah, it is.
looking at looking at the future as probabilities is an effective way of planning for the future rather than in a binary or this is just the consensus view and I'm going with that.
And I sort of make two more quick points, and that is part of this is about public discussion of risks, so we find common ground. If I'm doing things within sort of, as I'm trying to work on how we do contingency and preparedness, I won't be gathering a consensus of everybody's risk map. I'll be working within my own group, and we'll have our own risk map, which might be very different from the average consensus risk map in society. But at least when we talk collectively, we can have a common space. And one of the reasons you're doing that is that part of the risk we face in all of this is growing social polarization, tribalization, self-others. So we need to be able to talk about these things and in some way find these sort of common grounds. It itself is part of how we can work towards reducing some of the risks by having these sort of conversations.
All right, well, thank you so much, David. I greatly appreciate it. If people want to learn more about the stuff you're working on, is there a website or something they can go to?
Well, you can look at my website, which is www.Korowicz Human Systems, that's KOROWICZ, Human Systems, one long string of words.com.
Great. And if you appreciate video content like this on the internet or elsewhere, please let us know. Like and subscribe. And I know about 90% of the people watching this have not subscribed, so please press subscribe and ring the bell so you get notifications. You can always change your mind at another day, and leave a comment. And if you watch the whole thing, let's see, what word can you put in there? Walden. So type Walden in the comments, and then I'll know you watched the whole thing. And you can ask a question or something. Thank you so much, David. I appreciate your time today.
Thanks, Aaron.